Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's interesting. I have a very realistic expectation of a Sunday morning session. About 100 people registered for the session, and I thought if I get like a third, I'll be doing really well. But I understand the exhaustion after so many days of being here. You're engaging with people, and getting up on Sunday morning is kind of rough. You're like, I could just sleep in a little longer. So I am happy that you all are here, and I'm excited to talk to you today about my topic. My colleague, Dr. Jessica ChenFeng, is not with me, as you can see. She's going to tell you a little bit about why she's not here in a little video that she put together for the presentation. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what I'm hoping to accomplish in our very short time here together. And my preference actually is to have a smaller group for discussion, but we'll just kind of feel that out as people trickle in. So the goal today is really to talk about what Jessica and I mean by this concept of giving voice to beginning or early career MFTs, to increase your sense of self-awareness, to help you engage in supportive discussions about personal statuses such as race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and to share how those statuses may have been challenged by colleagues, faculty, supervisors, and clients. And then to connect your own personal self-awareness to advocacy and outreach for diverse communities in needs of clinical services. So basically, how Jessica and I think about these things is really to go back to grad school or to go back to your early training or your first day, and to think about this idea that the self is the most important aspect of the therapist, and that we need to connect to ourselves and to really increase our confidence in our own self in order to be successful as therapists. So if I could just get an idea of how many of you are master's level? Oh, sweet. That's always my hope. And how many of you are licensed? Okay, great, perfect. Any supervisors in the room? No? Okay, great. Okay, so that actually will make this much easier for me. I won't have to say like 5 different things as I'm talking to you. I can just talk to you all as in process developing therapists, which is helpful. So I'm going to let Dr. Jessica ChenFeng introduce herself to you, and then I'm going to introduce myself to you. Oh, it's not me. I guess it's above me.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica ChenFeng, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you there in person. By the time that you see this, I will have hopefully already given birth to our baby, or I'm about to any moment. So thank you so much for coming to this presentation that Dana and I put together. This is very personal to us, and so for this first video I wanted to briefly introduce myself to you. I am someone who was born and raised in Los Angeles. I identify as a second-generation Taiwanese American cisgender heterosexual woman. This is my 4th year teaching as an assistant professor at California State University, Northridge, which is in the northern part of Los Angeles. And I love working there alongside Dana. We have wonderful students, wonderful community and faculty. Maybe just to briefly share about my experience in the field. I've been in the field since 2005 when I began my own master's program. And I didn't know this at the time, but really I was trying to be the ideal therapist. And I didn't know till years later that that was really a white therapist with very westernized values And I didn't really have supervisors along the way who were curious about my cultural identity, did not necessarily see that my social location had any particular strength or contribution to my clinical work. And quite frankly, I was really good at being model minority, and so I did clinical work really well, and exceeded a lot of expectations along the way, but really I think also developed quite a bit of anxiety as I kept growing, because essentially I was disconnected from who I was. And so in the next video, I'll speak more about my work then when I became an educator and a supervisor, and how that really opened my eyes to my own experience. So thanks for being here. Looking forward to hearing from Dana how today goes, and chat with you in a few minutes.
So that's my colleague, Dr. Jess, or Jessica. Her students call her Dr. Jess. And she and I came together in our career about 4 years ago, and we just started talking about our experiences as trainees and interns, and then really started talking about our experiences as supervisors, and just feeling a little bit like in our training, in our development as therapists, we sort of lost touch with who we were as individual people. And so one of the things that we talked about was, how can we in our early career, I'm a little bit farther along than Jessica in my career, but how can we as educators and supervisors help actual beginning or early career therapists to not have to rely on supervisors or professors to bring forth the parts of your identities that are informing how you do therapy. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And so we started talking about this, I think her first year at CSUN, and it was such an enriching, like an awakening. I'm not alone in this. I wasn't alone in this as I was going through my development, and I don't want other trainees and interns to feel kind of alone in terms of how to bring their whole selves into the field. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, and then we'll get a little bit more into the details. So my name is Dana Stone, and I identify as a biracial black-white female. I am very aware of my lighter skin as a biracial female. I identify as cisgender. I was born and raised in Southern California as well as Jessica, but I was born and raised in San Diego. And moved a little bit all over the place to get my education. So I lived in Colorado. I got my master's degree in California, and then I got my PhD in Virginia at Virginia Tech. Then I spent 5 years in Oregon teaching and supervising master's level students, and now I've been at CSUN in northern Los Angeles for 6 years. I had an awesome experience becoming a therapist, and I also had a really challenging experience becoming a therapist. And part of that was because I have what I consider an invisible minority status. And so there are lots of people who have invisible minority statuses that if you don't self-disclose can just kind of be kept under wraps. And a lot of trainees and interns feel like they need to keep parts of their identity sort of under wraps as they're becoming a therapist. And so I didn't feel like I needed to keep my racial identity a secret. Many people can recognize that I'm a biracial person, but by the same token, many people only see me as white. And so as identifying as a person of color, that was an interesting world to navigate. And in particular, most of my clients for most of my training were white. And so there was this assumption of whiteness by my clients, which led to some interesting experiences around race and racism in the therapy room. And sometimes those experiences are covert for trainees and interns. There are covert experiences of racism and sexism, heterosexism in the therapy room, but sometimes they're covert. And as we're growing and developing, we don't necessarily know what to do with those experiences, how to talk about them. And oftentimes, actually, our supervisors don't know how to talk to us about those experiences that we might be having. And so that led Jessica and I to really wanting to create a space for early career MFTs to learn how to actually become advocates for themselves around parts of their identity and bringing their whole selves into therapy, and that could maybe be a stepping stone to becoming an advocate for clients in the future. But we believe that, first and foremost, the self of the therapist is critical in sort of developing and holding yourself up, and that's going to enable you to serve the clients that you so desire to serve in your work as marriage and family therapists. Still with me? Okay. So we are actually writing a book on this topic. We've done a lot of research just to sort of see what's out there for early career therapists about self of the therapist things. And there are things available, but they're older. And so Dr. Jess and I are really excited to be writing a book about this topic. And it's going to be kind of a workbook of sorts for beginning therapists in their master's programs, typically, to kind of work through and sort of develop your confidence around who you are and who you want to be and what parts of yourself you want to bring into your clinical work, into your supervision, into the classroom, etc. I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Jess take us on our next little part of this talk, and then I will take it from there.
So Dana and I thought that it might be helpful to talk about, why this workshop, why are we actually, Dana will probably tell you, we're working on a book manuscript related to this topic of supporting new or beginning MFTs to flourish in the field and find our voices. So when I started supervising a couple years back, a lot of my supervisees were actually women of color, Puerto Rican, Korean, Mexican American, different backgrounds, here in LA, and now it's much more broad and diverse as well. And a common story I kept hearing was these women felt incompetent or as though they were not as good as their peers. And when we talked about who these peers were, they tended to be white American classmates who sort of had the natural therapist vibe. And so what I realized is that our field, the way that we structure and formulate our training, our supervision, is really based on very limited, the models of our field, and there's a lot of cultural bias in those. And when supervisors and educators don't see how that can be harmful to many of our students who come from very different backgrounds, different cultural, ethnic, religious heritages that have a wealth of contribution to offer clients in the field, we can expect things of our students that are really incongruent with who they've been raised to be. And so, that's the need that we've seen as supervisors, as educators, and, we're hoping today is going to be a dialogue. Both Dana and I have taken many years to at least come to some level of awareness for our own growth. What does it mean to always remain culturally humble as we work alongside students, always considering that there are new things for me to understand about someone's abilities and their strengths, and how that can be an asset to the clinical work that they're doing. And so we hope that the dialogues that you engage in today will be meaningful to you, that it will contribute to your growth, to your community back wherever you serve. And a side note is that even though I'm not here, if there's anything that we talk about that you would love to connect with us or me specifically about, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is jessica.chenfeng@csun.edu. Thanks so much and enjoy the conference.
Okay, so that's actually the key. The last part that Jessica mentioned was moving into the role of supervisor. And I became a supervisor when I was still not licensed, because I worked in a state where I could supervise students while I was in the process of getting licensed. So I was a supervisor in training and still an intern therapist. And I worked in a predominantly white community with predominantly white students, and every once in a while there would be a student who identified with some non-white or different gendered identity, different sexual orientation. And I found that I had students who felt a little bit different coming to me and sort of seeking me out as someone they could talk to about those parts of themselves that they weren't sure what to do with. They weren't sure that they were acceptable. And the most profound experience for me was an African-American male student. So if we look around the room today, we can see that we are a more female-dominated field. And then in lots of spaces, we have fewer people of color or of other minority or marginalized statuses in our spaces. And so this student approached me and said, you know, I'm wondering if I can talk to you about what it's like for me as a black male to walk into a therapy room with mostly white clients, because they don't expect to see me. And then I walk into that space and there's reactions, nonverbal reactions sometimes, and I'm not quite sure what to do about that. And I was still very early in my career, and I thought to myself, yes, of course, let's talk about that, because I had never talked about any of my experiences up to that point. And so I thought to myself, yes. And so it's been my students who have taught me the importance, actually, of bringing my whole self into therapy, but also to support students bringing their whole selves into therapy. And so since that time, I've had various students over the years who have sought me out. And I don't say that to toot my own horn, but I say it because I think it's such a critical thing for you as early career MFTs to look for those people that you can connect with and say, hey, this thing is happening for me, or this part of my experience is really difficult and I need someone to be able to talk to openly about that without judgment. And so that, for me, that was just such a critical experience, and that happened maybe my second year of supervising, and I've been supervising now for over 10 years, and I've had experiences all along the way. But the other thing I've done as a supervisor, and Jessica would say the same thing, is we've really become very intentional about talking with our students about who they are. Who are they bringing into this field? What parts of themselves brought them here? Because if you all can remember back to, I don't know how many of you had to interview to get into your master's program, but can you remember back to that question, why do you want to be an MFT? And most people would answer that question from their own personal experience. And yet then we tend to sort of tuck that away somewhere through the process, because we're like, then we get into this mode of, what does it mean to be a professional? Do I have the right theory? Am I asking the right questions? On and on and on and on and on, right? And then we forget sometimes through the process why we started this in the first place. And a part of it for me is the human, like there's the human aspect of it. I wanted to give voice to people like me, or I wanted to make sure that kids in foster care had a space. We all have various reasons for why we wanted to come to the field, but I think sometimes we lose sight of that in our development. And so one of my hopes is to just inspire you to connect with those parts of yourself that maybe you've been suspending, or you feel like you need to suspend. I've had some supervisees talk to me about, I'm exhausted at the end of the day because I feel like in this space I can be this way, but then when I go into the therapy room I need to be this way, and then in supervision I need to be this way. And how many of you have heard of that term, code switching? So this idea that I need to be, as Jessica said in the first video, I need to be kind of like the standard ideal of what a therapist is. And a lot of those images are the early times of our field are white males, older white males in particular. And as we're moving along in our field, we still don't have a lot of images of people who are maybe of different sexual orientations, different gender identities, different racial identities. We don't have those examples in front of us. We're not necessarily reading about those examples. And so hopefully you can sort of be inspired to kind of become your own example in a way. So I'm going to give you a little literature review. So one of the things that I like to do is when I become passionate about something, I actually like reading the literature. And most students go, I don't want to do a lit review. But what I found, and I want to inspire you just a little bit, what I found is that when I'm passionate about something, I get sucked in because I want to know what is really out there. How are people talking about these ideas in our field? And there's actually quite a bit of literature, not specifically in MFT, but in the field of psychotherapy, around talking about marginalized statuses with our supervisees, with our trainees, with our students. And so what researchers have found is that when faculty and supervisors are willing to be emotionally available, share their work or internal process. So if I'm willing to share with my supervisees and my students what might be happening for me in a moment or an experience that I've had in a similar situation, when supervisors and professors personalize things, there can be a positive learning and role modeling for students. So this is actually very common in feminist practice. So people who practice from a feminist supervision orientation or people who teach sort of from a feminist model, there's this, it's called more of a reflexive teaching. So the supervisor or the professor is using stories about themselves to help encourage their students and supervisees to bring themselves into the room too, those important parts of your identity into the room. And so it's not to blurry the lines between supervisor and trainee or intern, but it's actually to help facilitate a more genuine and congruent process. So what researchers have also found is that students and supervisees actually report much higher satisfaction in supervision when faculty and supervisors initially raise the topic of discussing culture and cultural differences. So when I talk about culture, I'm using a broad definition here. So I'm talking about race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity. I'm also talking about sexual orientation. So I want to be clear that this discussion around parts of your identity isn't limited to race and ethnicity, but sort of open to all parts of our identity. So the trick is that if you aren't training or being taught or supervised in an environment where the groundwork has been laid for you to talk about culture, race, ethnicity, gender, then we tend to, again, keep those parts out of the space. We keep that out of the classroom, we keep that out of supervision, and that can actually, again, create sort of this challenge for us as we develop as therapists. And so when those conversations are initiated early in your career, it becomes a part of your experience, and it becomes a part of how you do, how you think, and how you are in therapy, in the classroom, etc. So the other thing to keep in mind is that these conversations are relevant to all of us. They're not just important for people who identify with various marginalized statuses, but they're actually really important for all of our growth. Because when we're willing to talk about the things that we're challenged by, the things from our own experience that are influencing our work with our clients, we actually help others learn and grow too. And we're encouraging others to think about those things in the space with their clients, to be curious about those things with their clients. But it really does start with us as the therapists in our own learning. So attending to cultural issues and topics of power, oppression, and privilege within the supervisor relationship is an important step in helping supervisees to be able to do the same with their clients. And so the goal here is for, the hope here is for supervisors, again, to be initiating these conversations, for faculty to be helping you all engage in dialogue around these things. But again, what we find is that that's not what's always happening. And Dr. Jess and I, our own experiences, not to the critique of our professors or supervisors, we didn't have that. We didn't have supervisors who felt comfortable necessarily, or who had it at the forefront to bring up those topics in supervision. So one of the things that I just want to share with you is one of my own experiences, and then I would love to just kind of check in with you to see how you're thinking about what we're talking about so far. And I should probably check the time. Okay. So I'm going to share an experience as a trainee. So the first time my own racial identity came up in therapy. So I basically went into the field, went into my grad program, was in love with everything that I was learning about MFT and systems thinking and all those things, and wasn't really thinking much about, I was thinking a lot about my family of origin stuff, because that comes up really early, like, oh, wow, how many of you have diagnosed your family with like 50 different diagnoses? And, you know, I definitely was bringing that part of my experience into my learning, like, oh my gosh, my family's really dysfunctional, and should I be here? I probably need more help than I realize, like that kind of stuff. But I wasn't really thinking about like who I was, like as an individual, who I was as a racial being, who I was as a woman. Wasn't necessarily thinking about those things. And one of my very first experiences was I worked at a university clinic, and I had a young white male client, and I was in the Southwest, and this client had been accused of sexual assault. And so he was very agitated, like he was going through hearings through the university. He was very distressed, understandably. And you know, I wasn't his therapist to determine whether he'd done it or not. I was just there to support him and to give him space to sort of process what was happening for him. And it was during a time in my development as a therapist when I was being observed by a supervisor. And I use descriptors to sort of emphasize to you how important I think it is to talk about parts of our identity. So I was being supervised by a white male supervisor from the South also. This is not a bad thing. It was just something that I became very aware of in the session. So I was sitting across from my young male client who's very agitated, very upset, and he starts throwing around the N-word. And I remember just thinking, like, I froze, like my heart like froze in my chest. And I thought, it was the first time in therapy that I thought, it was actually the second time in therapy that I thought, this client doesn't know that I'm not white. This client thinks I'm white. So there's an assumption of sameness, but then I also thought, but this is therapy and this is their space, and what am I supposed to do about that? Like, and so I just kind of froze up. I remember that feeling in my chest, and I just kind of sat with it, and then I sort of skimmed over it, and then we went on to something else. And then I remember walking out of the session feeling overwhelmed by a lot of the content of the session, but those particular things that he was throwing around, I was like, I don't know what to do about that. And not a chance was I going to start talking about that in supervision. Like, it just didn't even cross my mind. And my supervisor, like, we sit down, and he says to me almost immediately, why didn't you, he used the N-word, why didn't you say something or do something? And I thought to myself, what? Like, what would I say? What would I do? And again, remember, I'm like maybe my second year of seeing clients, and I don't feel, I'm still like, is this even the right career? Have I made the right decision? And you're like, why didn't you address that? And I remember thinking, like, when I reflect back on it now, his intention was good. It was well-meaning, because he didn't miss it. And he saw the significance of it. But the way he approached it actually silenced me more, because I actually felt ashamed. I felt ashamed that I didn't address it. Like, why didn't I address it? Why? Oh my gosh. And then, it didn't send me into a spiral of depression, but it definitely, it hit me in a way that as I have moved on, I've learned intention is important, to assume good intentions by our supervisors and our colleagues when they ask questions like that. But I've also learned to maybe facilitate a discussion around that in a way that would be more helpful. So what would have probably been more helpful to me in that time would have been like, I'm really overwhelmed by what this person said to me. Can we just talk about how I'm feeling? And then maybe we can talk about sort of the problem solving, like how might I address that in the future? Or the flip side, from the supervisor perspective, I wonder how that was. How was that for you? Just plain and simple. And the reason why I share that story is I remember very clearly being in the supervisee position and how much that experience influences how I supervise. But in the moment as a supervisee, I didn't necessarily know how to advocate for myself and how to say, and how to recognize good intention and to be able to say, I don't know why I didn't address it, but can we just talk about how I'm feeling? Like, to give me the strength. So to empower you actually to flip when supervisors might ask you questions that aren't necessarily helpful, but to try to create space for those processes in your supervision, in your training. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. So as I know, this session is not very long. We don't have a ton of time left, but since the group is a little bit smaller, I'm just wondering if any of you might have experiences that you might want to share, or thoughts that you might have about what we've talked about so far today. Yeah? Oh, I have to give you the microphone.
Hello?
Yes.
So your story just reminded me of my very first client as an intern. And it was a white female in her 40s, late 40s, almost 50s, I think. Actually, I'm sorry, early 50s. And she was experiencing depression. And the first thing she said, she's like, "Oh, you're black." And I said, "Yeah, how's that going to be for you? Is it going to be okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, as long as you can help me." I said, "Okay." So I felt immediately like, "Are you kidding me? What? This is my first session ever." And as she went along, she too used the N-word in reference to what another family member referenced her daughter's boyfriend. And I immediately was like, "Are you kidding me?" So not only was it a problem that I'm black, and now you're just going to use the N-word in here like it's just everything. And so I just let it go, and I was like, okay, and just kind of, I was so glad when the session ended. At the place that I was at, we did a lot of peer consultation, and I was like, I need a session. I need a session right now because I need to know what to do with this. And I really, in the moment, I kind of resolved, okay, this is her world. This is her truth. It had nothing to do with me per se. And although I wish she was sensitive to me, but that wasn't her purpose, and it wasn't her. It just wasn't part of her world, I believe, to be sensitive to that. And so that's kind of how I resolved it, and just I was able to kind of continue on with her later, and without any sort of edge on my part or anything, because after a while it was okay that I was black.
And I think one of the questions that comes up for me as I'm listening to you is, not my question, sorry, my comment is that you came out saying, I need to talk about this with someone, like I need to find someone to talk to. So how many of you have had experiences, and again, it doesn't have to be around race or ethnicity specifically, but have had experiences in supervision, in your therapy, and you've come out and you've been able to talk about them with someone? Okay, so there's some yeses. Have any of you had experiences where you've come out of those spaces and not actually been able to talk about, or had to maybe you felt like you had to sort of keep some of that stuff tucked away? Yeah, a little bit. So another story that I have is a more recent story with one of my supervisees, and it was an experience. It was such a learning experience for me. But my supervisee basically identified as genderqueer, and had shared that in our supervision space. And I remember not thinking, I'm so glad that we have a space where we can talk openly about parts of our identity and our social location. And then at some point I became aware, very aware of how people were referring to them. And they had said, I prefer the pronouns they, them, their. And so I was working really hard to shift my language, working with this student. And I remember the student coming to me at one point early on saying, you're the first professor who's actually made an effort to respect my identity. You're the first professor who's giving an effort, and I just wanted to say that I really appreciated that. And one of the things I make mistakes all the time. I fumble, I stumble, but I just remember thinking, I'm so glad that student was able to talk about kind of their experience and was actually able to give me feedback. So as a supervisor, I actually welcome the feedback when I make mistakes. And so they said that in other spaces, they weren't able to talk about that part of their identity, and that when it came up in therapy, which it did a lot actually, clients would ask lots of questions, especially younger clients being really curious. They didn't feel like they could necessarily talk about that in their other supervision group. And so just another example of times when maybe parts of our identity aren't, there isn't space for them.
So my story is pretty similar to yours, actually. So we actually do co-therapy at our clinic, at our university clinic, and I actually went in with my supervisor, and that was really intimidating. But we went into the room with the client together, and it was a 14-year-old transgender, and the whole session he kept referring to him as she. Anytime that he would talk about him in the third person, he would say she, and I was noticing it, and I didn't want to I was just following because he started it, so I was following. But when we went back for a consultation break, because I feel like now reflecting back on it, that because he was such an open supervisor, and he wasn't, because I knew that he would take the feedback in a good way, I said, hey, I think that you kept using she, and we should be using he. And he was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know, thank you so much for telling me. And I was like, yeah, maybe we should say something. He was like, oh yeah, absolutely, we'll go back and apologize. And we did. When we came back in the room, he said that immediately to him. He was like, I think we've been using she, I just want to apologize. And then we corrected it for the rest of the session. So I felt like just because he was such a good supervisor that I had the confidence to be able to say something to him about it,
That's a great example, and it's so important to share examples of you using your voice as a therapist, as a trainee, a supervisee, using your voice to advocate for your clients too. And again, oftentimes, so my premise is that I think that it starts with us. We need to be able to advocate for ourselves, but sometimes actually it's easier to advocate for others first. So that can be a part of the experience. But that's such a wonderful example of, I don't want to let this go by. I want to address this, and I'm going to, and it worked out. So thank you for sharing that.
Just wondering about your experiences with your colleagues that are opposite sex, race, anything like that. How are you?
In these experiences?
Exactly.
Okay. So would you say in the classroom or? Yeah, please.
Just if you have someone that racially it's a little ignorant, and I say ignorant to the fact that they're not open to learn like anything else. How do you approach that?
Yeah, that's really hard. So one of the reasons why we want to be talking about this is because we believe that our development as therapists happens in the classroom, in our training spaces, in our supervision spaces. And so your question is extremely relevant in that how do you handle it with colleagues who maybe you feel are a little closed off? And I would say similarly, actually, I have a model. I'm afraid this is going to start making noise if I hold it. We have a model of approaching the subject that I'm going to share with you. I'm going to give you some examples. But I wonder if other people might have experiences where maybe they've addressed a difficult or attempted a difficult conversation with a colleague around race or ethnicity in their class or in their supervision group.
So this isn't a situation in which I addressed it. This was a situation in which it was addressed with me. And I was, at this point, I see it as a gift, and I feel very fortunate that I had a colleague who went to the head of our program and said something. So this was a situation that was a microaggression that I had made outside of the classroom, outside of a class setting with a colleague and a friend. And it caused a pretty intense argument between the two of us, and she ended up going to the head of our school essentially, and had a conversation with them. And I spent the next year working with them individually, one-on-one, to then be able to go through the process of writing an accountability letter at the end. And it was a huge shift for me in how I look at all of everything, and how I actually look at myself within the context of actually who I am and actually do the work. So I don't know. I know that it's not always the way to go about it, and I know that that's not always the easiest to do, to hold others accountable, but I'm very appreciative that my colleague did that. So
yeah, so in spaces where, thank you so much, in spaces where we can't directly confront, that it might be a sort of roundabout way. But ideally, if we're teaching you to engage in difficult conversations, to facilitate difficult conversations with your clients, the hope is that you can engage in those difficult conversations with your colleagues. It's typically going to happen first in the classroom space, but there's a catch there. It has to be facilitated well by the person in charge, or those of you sitting in the classroom space have to feel brave or strong or compelled in some way to initiate those conversations. And I don't know the circumstances of your situation, but my guess is that person felt compelled, but didn't necessarily feel confident to confront you directly, but they didn't want to let it slip by. And so it's a great example of not letting it slip by and seeing the positive impact of not letting it slip by, but how difficult it can be to directly confront someone. So I do have some sample pieces of dialogue I'm going to show you, but I saw your hand up, so do you have something to say? Okay.
I was just, I'm a new student, and I've been in a lot of the racial discussions throughout this whole conference, and I had the same question as my colleague here. And yesterday and I had another Caucasian colleague who asked me, she was like, what's post-slave syndrome? Why is that even an issue now? And she just didn't know. And because of what I've heard here, I just told her, and I put it in a context that she understood. And she was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I was scared to say that to her, but she was very receptive. And like how you said, I guess it feels good to hear when other people say that they understand. Or if they don't know, they just ask.
They ask about it. Yes, being curious. So what do we learn as therapists? One of the most important parts of our job is being curious, right? Coming from a genuinely curious place. But I think we tend to be tentatively curious, or like closed off about things like race and gender and sexual orientation and religion. Like we're like, that's like we shouldn't talk about that. And yet we're standing in front of, well, at least I am, and my colleague Jessica are standing in front of you in classrooms saying, we need to ask our clients about this. We need to engage in conversation around social location and the impact of social location on the person's experience, how their experience are their problems, right? But if we're telling you to do that, and yet we're not encouraging you to do that with each other, how are you going to do that with your clients? It's almost like a catch-22 that we sort of set you up, like you need to do all of these things, but we don't actually necessarily help you do it. And I'm not saying all of us. I mean, I'm guilty on both. I think I try really hard to facilitate dialogue amongst students because I think it starts there. And I think sometimes I miss opportunities to facilitate dialogue, to model engagement around those conversations. I believe very strongly that, and the literature supports me, but it's my personal belief, the onus of responsibility is on me as your instructor and your supervisor to help facilitate those conversations. But where I'm coming from today is that we don't always have supervisors and instructors who feel that same sense of responsibility. So what, again, my goal for you is to feel empowered to bring it up in places where you feel like you can. We will not always feel like we can do that. My example with my client is one, and we've had a few others where, we don't always feel like we can do that, but my hope is that we can. Any other thoughts or comments or things you'd like to share? Okay. So, safety and support is obviously a critical component of having these conversations with our colleagues and then engaging in these conversations with our clients. But we don't always have those spaces, and so then the question becomes, how might we engage in those conversations with our colleagues and with our clients? So my colleague and I have this model of connection. So what I'm going to tell you is the first thing in your relationships with your supervisors, with your colleagues, and with your clients, so I think this can apply to each of those situations, you obviously need to evaluate your level of connection and safety with them. So we are proposing that there are 3 possible levels. There's probably millions, but 3 possible levels. So the first level is you've not had any previous dialogue with the colleague or your supervisor or your client about areas of social location. So again, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. You're not sure how they'll react, and so you need to feel it out. So what we suggest is, I just have to pull my sheet of paper because I have some examples here. So colleague to colleague. I'm wrestling with ideas of race or ethnicity or identity in my supervision. Would you be open to supporting each other and chatting about these sort of things? So I'm thinking about these things and wondering, are you open too? So you're not necessarily putting yourself out there, but you're checking in, like you're sort of testing the safety. Does that make sense? So you kind of feel it out. So I'm thinking about these things. I'm wondering how you feel about maybe talking about some of these things with me. So that's sort of leaving yourself safe, because you're not necessarily putting something really personal on the line. You're just kind of putting something out there. So with a supervisor, I'm interested in better understanding the differences I share with my clients. I'm wondering if we can incorporate more readings or discussions about race, ethnicity, gender regarding clients? Can we incorporate that into supervision? So again, you're feeling out the safety, like, is this a safe space to talk about these things? You're still sort of self-protective, but you're saying this is important to you. So on a second level, you have some sense of awareness that your colleague or your supervisor has some ideas about social location or has talked about it in some way, shape, or form, but it's never been brought up in your relationship with them. So an approach there. So this is like you're feeling like I feel like there's a good chance that we're going to be able to engage in dialogue around this. So a second level, colleague to colleague, might be, I recognize that we're in different positions here, and conversations about difficult topics aren't always easy to engage in on a personal level with each other. However, in my effort for continual growth as a colleague, I'm working to take more risks to dialogue about topics related to, I'm just going to keep using race or ethnicity. Is this something you'd be open to talking more about with me? So we've started to integrate the personal in a little bit. So we're sort of testing the waters, and how do they respond to that? So it's an invitation. So then student to supervisors, yeah?
So in that dialogue sample that you just gave us for level 2, did you begin with, I recognize that we're in different spaces?
We're in different positions. So this is typically when you're engaging in a colleague who might be different with you around parts of your identity.
So in level 2, you're actually, when I'm reading that, it's not so clear to me that I recognize that they're in a different space.
Sure. That's true. So my example is coming from, maybe we've had some of these conversations in the classroom. Like, I'm aware that we have some level of awareness that we're different, but you could also approach not having necessarily had direct conversations about differences. And you could say, I also have to be clear about my bias. I invite conversations around social location and identity in almost every class that I teach so that it can be integrated in the conversation, but I recognize that that may not always be the case, and so differences may not have been talked about. So then when we approach someone, we might not necessarily say, I recognize that we're different, but I think actually we're all different in some way. So does that make sense? Okay, sure. So I haven't talked about power, and some of you have been to other presentations, and the discussion of power is really critical in the student to supervisee, or the supervisee to supervisor relationship, and I recognize that. And part of what I'm really hoping for you is to help you have a sense of empowerment to bring these things up with your supervisor. So a level 2 approaching your supervisor would be, I've heard you talk about gender identity, and I'd like to learn more about it. Would it be possible to incorporate discussions about race, sexuality, religion, etc. into our supervision process? So in level 1, student to supervisor, you're really feeling it out. Is this person open to this? In level 2, you've heard the supervisor mention things, but maybe it's been indirectly. And so you're going to be a little more direct. Can we talk about these things in supervision? And so then level 3 would be a situation where you know, based on interactions, based on teaching, whatever it might be, that the colleague, supervisor, or client is conscious about social location. So perhaps they've demonstrating it in their conversation, in their teaching, in supervision, but you've never talked about it in your one-on-one relationship with them, and you're wanting to maybe bring more of yourself into your growth as a supervisee. So for a clinician who is working with a supervisor who is racially, ethnically, or different in terms of gender or gender identity, or even sexual orientation, and that has been brought out, would you be open to us connecting around some of our differences as supervisor and supervisee? Sometimes I think about what it means to be a biracial therapist in therapy, And I know you're not biracial, but it's something that I would like to be able to talk about with you. I would like to be able to talk about that in supervision and how I think that's influencing my experience, or it's influencing how I view my clients. That would be if I felt super comfortable. With a colleague, I know we talk about race in class, and it seems to be a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that it's really important to have these conversations, and I've been thinking about how race plays out between the two of us. Would you be open to dialoguing about this together? So again, there's no like, you said something that offended me, I'm really upset, da 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 da. It's like, I want to talk about these things with you, but I need to know, are you open to this? And being pretty direct about what specifically you want to talk about. So is it gender, race, ethnicity, etc. Does that help a little bit, some of those examples? So this model is still in development, but our goal is to give you some examples of how to sort of, the number one thing with your supervisors and colleagues is to assess your level of connection and safety. Do you feel a sense of connection with them? Do you feel safe enough to approach these conversations with them? And then to feel empowered, to not leave who you are at the door when you walk into the classroom, to not leave who you are at the door when you walk into supervision, but to bring all of that with you and to kind of wrestle with it in the space out loud when you can, so that you can then, as an advocate for yourself, be able to advocate for those clients in ways that they may not be able to advocate for themselves in their lives. So trying to bring it full circle and wrap up, I apologize for not being done. It's 8:46. I will get to my last slide. So the premise here is that advocacy begins with advocating for ourselves. When we are able to use our voices to advocate for ourselves in those conversations, those spaces in the classroom, in supervision, and with our colleagues, and then eventually with our clients, we bring awareness about others who may have shared or similar experiences. When we engage with our supervisors and our colleagues and our clients, we open the door for others in the future to do so as well. So I sort of see, again, my responsibility as supervisor to facilitate, to initiate these conversations, but recognizing, having been a supervisee, that's not always easy to do. It's not always happening, and as a supervisee, I just really want to encourage you to bring your whole selves into therapy and to be willing to take risks based on how safe you feel to start those dialogues in your supervision and with your colleagues. So I hope this was somewhat helpful for you, and I appreciate you being here early on a Sunday. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And if you want information, that our emails are here. I also have business cards, or if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you so much.